We have some mints at the house, so I just grabbed a mint out of habit in the back. They dissolve at very different rates. I almost didn't make it to get that one out of my mouth. It is good to see everyone this evening. We are continuing our look at some of the stories of individuals in Hebrews chapter 11 that are there sometimes confusingly. Some of the ones we've looked at, it's like, oh yeah, it makes sense that he's there. Joseph, for example, it makes sense that he's in this record of faith, this hall of fame of faith, if you will. But we're going to look at one tonight that's much more on the confusing end of things as we go into another story of faith. Samson is a very interesting figure as recorded for us in the book of Judges. As we begin his story, he is one of the few individuals that we actually have his birth foretold and the parents told about who he's going to be. We have a few other figures where this happens. Certainly Jesus is the most famous example of this. But we only have a few. Most of the time, you don't have this kind of, oh, this is going to be like, you're going to have a son, he's going to do this and that and the other. You need to be ready because this is about to be an amazing thing God's going to do through your child. That's not a very common thing in Scripture. And yet, Samson is one of those individuals. His mother and his father are told, this is going to be a son that God is going to use to deliver his people. So, she is with child, she gives birth, they have this baby, they begin to raise him. She has been told, specifically, in this particular instance, you are not to allow him to partake of the fruit of, or the produce of the grapes, because that's part of the Nazirite vow. You're also not supposed to cut his hair, things like that. All things that are part of the specific vow that someone's to be dedicated to God this way. He's born, and as he begins to grow up, it becomes very quickly evident that he is a very strong individual. Now, this is not photoshopped or anything. There are people who have pretty big muscles, and yet, and this is mine, by the way, no, I'm just kidding. There are people who have pretty big muscles, but even among those who actually are exceptionally strong, even Samson started to stand out beyond what seems to be possible. He begins to demonstrate a degree of strength that can only come from God. This is very promising because you think about the timeline and the time period that Israel is in at this point. Well, they are not only under oppression, this time by the Philistines, if you remember that cycle that's going on in Judges that we talked about with Gideon as well. Samson, as a strong individual, well, that means he can probably make a pretty good warrior out of this kid, and probably he's going to be instrumental in fighting against their enemies and delivering them from the enemies on the battlefield. So all this seems to be really good. Everything seems to be exactly not only as God has promised, but seems to be very auspicious, maybe we should say. He gets old enough to where he is beginning to make some of his own decisions about his life and moving forward. And then we see the first thing that kind of makes us scratch our heads. He is going with his parents, traveling through an area, and he sees a young Philistine woman. Remember, the Philistines are not only the oppressors, but they are by no means followers of God. They are pagans. They believe in idols and all these things. But he sees this Philistine woman, and as we might say, he is smitten. He wants her. He wants to take her as his wife. His parents are confused, as you might expect. After all, it is not right, according to the law of Moses, for an Israelite to marry a Philistine or any other Canaanite person, because ultimately that could create a stumbling block for Israel to pull them away from God and go after idols. However, we're told something very interesting as the story continues to unfold. And that is that his parents didn't realize this was actually from God. Meaning that Samson was looking for an opportunity through this marriage to move against the Philistines. Now that phrase, it was from God, is very interesting. We don't know, we're not told, if that means God had specifically informed Samson, hey, I want you to do this. I don't think that's really an indication of the text. It seems to be more of Samson knows what his job is, to be a deliverer of Israel, and therefore this is something that is in accord with God's plans for him, and he is kind of doing this. So maybe, thinking about this morning, right, a little bit of providence is going on here. But whatever the case, this still, even though it doesn't seem like it on the surface, still seems to be, okay, well, it seems like we're still on track, right? It seems like we're still pursuing God's plan, even if it seems a bit unorthodox to the naked eye. Okay, I think we're still on track. So he convinces his parents, and they're going to go and make the arrangements. Of course, in those days, there's a whole transaction that has to happen for a marriage to take place. So they travel to make the arrangements to marry Samson to this Philistine. As they are traveling, it seems that Samson gets separated from his parents or something along the way, and a lion attacks. Now, I don't know how many lions y'all have killed. I've only killed like 3 or 4 with my bare hands anyway, but lions usually, when they attack, they are fierce. They are not creatures that even that guy with the big muscles we had the picture of a second ago can take on without usually a lot of people to help them, even back in the ancient times, and very specific types of weapons. If you're going to do a hunt in ancient times with a big cat, usually you're going to want not only bows and arrows if possible, but at least spears, some kind of long weapon. He has his bare hands. If you have to close hand-to-hand combat with a lion, you're probably going to lose. We are informed, and it's a little bit gross maybe to our the way we think about things, but we are informed that Samson takes the lion and rips it apart like one would rip apart a baby goat. Now, of all the comparisons, I don't know that I would have gone with that one, but for them, that was more common, right? He rips it apart like nothing. Once again, we see, okay, God is definitely at work here. There is definitely something that is beyond human abilities, as he is able to just kill this lion outright. He kills the lion. He leaves the body on the side of the road. He continues on with his parents. They go on and make the arrangements. But later on, as they're traveling back, the initial arrangements have been made, then they're going to have to make the trip again later. He passes the lion again. Again, it seems like he's kind of gone off by himself a little bit, and maybe he's curious, I think the text says. I don't remember exactly what the wording is there. But he looks, and inside the carcass of the lion, the bees have made a hive. And they have, of course, as bees do, in this hive started to produce honey. Now, honey at this time for them was a major delicacy. For us, we think, we have sugar and all this kind of stuff. Well, honey is A, more healthy, but B, naturally occurring. So for them, they didn't have the sugar the way that we do now, but they would sweeten things with honey. So this was a delicacy for them, but it's in a carcass. Now, this is where we have to understand a little more about the Israelite law. For any Israelite, eating something out of a carcass like this that had been sitting there for a while is a big no-no. That makes you unclean, according to the law. Now, you can make amends, I guess, for the uncleanness that would cause by going through certain rituals and stuff like that. But Samson's in a little bit of a different position because he's not just an Israelite. He's supposed to be a Nazirite. That means even for relatives and things like that, he is not supposed to go anywhere near a carcass like this, much less eat from it. He goes and eats from it and brings some to his parents without telling them that it's out of a carcass, and they eat some as well. This is where our eyebrows should really start raising, especially if you were a Jew reading this kind of, with a familiarity with the old law, or if you're nowadays, when we have the benefit of hindsight, looking back and seeing the law. Either way, your eyebrows should be starting to raise, like, wait a minute. This guy is not really seeming like he's living the way God would expect a hero of his to live. But it gets worse. It gets worse. So he goes and fulfills this marriage. He goes through the wedding ceremony, all these kind of things. And a bunch of Philistines are there because, they're friends of the bride and all this kind of stuff, or friends of the bride's family anyway. And he poses a riddle to them at the feasting that they're doing at the wedding. He poses a riddle to them, basically alluding to this lion with honey in it. Now, I'm sorry, but I don't care if it's ancient times or modern times. If you give a riddle and the answer is a lion carcass with honey in it, I don't think it's a fair riddle, okay? And I think he knows this. I think he's been very intentional. He's trying to get something out of these Philistines. Remember, he still does have it in his mind that ultimately, in his mind, this marriage is about finding ways to get back at the Philistines. So that's what's going on in his mind, even as he poses the riddle, from what we can tell. Well, the Philistines don't like to be losers. So they confront his new wife. And they try and ask her what the riddle is. She says, well, he hasn't told me. So they say, well, you're going to find out for us. You're going to get your husband to tell us the riddle, or to tell you the riddle, and then you're going to tell us, or else we're going to kill you and your family. Again, kind of sore losers, right? So she uses her feminine charms to convince her new husband to tell her what the answer to the riddle is. Lion, carcass, honey. And she tells the Philistines. The Philistines, on the final day, when the deadline is to answer the riddle, says, here's the answer. Samson's response is kind of funny. He says, if you hadn't been plowing with my heifer, you wouldn't have understood my riddle. Seems a little bit demeaning to refer to your wife that way, but in context with their culture, he's referring to kind of more of an illustration than actually calling his wife a cow. But nonetheless, the arrangement that had been made for the riddle, if he wins the bet, if you will, meaning they can't solve the riddle, they give him 30 changes of clothes. If they are able to guess the riddle, then they get 30 changes of clothes from him. Well, they've guessed the riddle. So he says, okay, fine, I'll live up to my end of the bargain. So he goes out and finds a group of 30 Philistines and kills them and takes their clothes and gives the clothes to his Philistine companions. And there we go. Now, again, this is, yes, a means by which Samson is starting to strike out against the Philistines. I mean, you just killed 30 of them, okay, woo, right? But just seems off, doesn't it? This doesn't seem like the way to go about this. But we keep on going. Because then he kind of storms off after this event. He's kind of upset about everything. Well, his new father-in-law gives his wife to someone else. So he comes back after a little while and says, I want to go see my wife. And his supposed father-in-law is like, oh, I married her off to somebody else because obviously you didn't seem to want her. You left. And now Samson is really angry. He says, you know what? What I'm about to do is not my fault. It's yours. And he takes, translations are a little bit sketchy here, whether we're talking about jackals or foxes or something like that. He takes some animals, some small animals, and ties pairs of them together with torches between the pair, like ties their tails around torches. Now, if you've ever seen small creatures like foxes or jackals or anything like that, they're kind of skittish anyway, but tie them back to back like that, and they're going to be really in a mess, and then put fire in the equation, I mean, you're just going to cause chaos. He turns them loose in the Philistines' fields. Now, once again, we have to step back a little bit into the ancient world. If you burn food, if you burn crops like that, this for them would basically be the equivalent of like biological warfare in our day. This is low. Now, I'm not saying it was wrong per se, but I just mean the perception of it. There's barely enough food to go around in their world at that time. I mean, remember, they don't have irrigation systems in the way that we do now. They didn't have, ways of producing the produce from the grain and things like that we do now. They had very limited harvests that were susceptible to a whole lot of things. You burn a harvest like this, I mean, this is a declaration of war, essentially. But he does it. And then, naturally, the Philistines get mad. They come after him and try to arrest him. We have several fights that happen. One of the big ones that's super fun, he is cornered at one point after this, as the Philistines start coming after him. He's cornered. He doesn't have a weapon with him. He finds a donkey's jawbone. And with a donkey's jawbone, and I don't know if this is a donkey here, by the way. I just typed in jawbone, and jawbone, I can't talk, and found this. But you can see how, that could work as a weapon. He takes this. He kills 1,000 people with it. Now, if you've ever watched one of those movies made in Bollywood or the old Kung Fu movies or something like that, they have some pretty crazy effects. Like there was one that came out recently just a few years ago where a guy fights hundreds of people just single-handedly, and it's no, that's not how that works. You can't win that way. Well, this actually was literally 1,000 people against one, and he won. Once again, God is still clearly working through this guy. But this isn't Gideon, a sword for the Lord, and for Gideon, all glory goes to God. This is, I'm a little bit, what should we call this? Bitter, jealous, want revenge, petty. That's the word I'm looking for. It's not the same, right? It's interesting, though, after this great deliverance, meaning after so many of Israel's enemies have been killed by a jawbone, Samson is very thirsty. And he approaches God, and this is one of the few times, in fact, I think this is the only time, except for the last moments of his life, which we'll talk about in a moment. This is the only other time we have recorded where Samson has any interaction with or reference to God at all. But he's thirsty to the point where he might pass out and die. And he says, God, you've just made this great deliverance from your servant. Now you're going to let me die of thirst? Now again, think about that statement. There's kind of two sides to it, aren't there? On the one hand, he's acknowledging it's God's power that allowed what just happened to happen. And he's also acknowledging that I'm your servant, although that was a typical way of referring to oneself in Israel. But he's also saying, I did this, now give me something, right? Now it's your job to take care of me. Almost like, okay, do your thing now. Imagine how God felt in that moment. Imagine the potential God would have seen in Samson. And now, yes, things are happening that are ultimately, providentially, occurring according to what God wants to happen in the end result, right? Philistines being defeated. But man, this doesn't seem like the best way to do it. Not from God's perspective, meaning from Samson's perspective. Nevertheless, God does provide water. And then, of course, we have another incident. Now, Samson sees a prostitute, and once again, smitten, goes after her. Philistines try and go after him again. Again, he fights them all off. Okay. Now, he's not even trying to marry a wife. He's just going after prostitutes. Another big no-no, by the way, for Israel and their law. But finally, he sees Delilah. Now, I do want to briefly give us a little bit of a sense of what's going on with Delilah, because I think sometimes we think of her as just, a heart of stone, evil person trying to seduce this guy for fun, all this kind of stuff. Most likely, she doesn't have a lot of choice in a lot of things that happen in this story. I just want to throw that out there, especially once the Philistine leaders come to her and say, hey, figure out what this guy's secret is. She either figures it out or she gets killed by the Philistine leaders, kind of like his first wife, right? So this is not exactly something she has a lot of choice in. I just want to give us that caveat in terms of the way Delilah is sometimes portrayed. But nonetheless, Delilah is a Philistine woman that Samson falls for, and they begin having whatever you want to call it, an affair or whatever. But the Philistine leaders tell Delilah, sometimes we say ask, but really they told her, you're going to find out what his secret is. And so she begins trying to find out. Now, he knows that he has been told, his mom, even before he was born, has been told, you don't shave your head. You also don't drink. You also do all these other things. Nazirite was supposed to be, you obey the law of Moses plus some other things, right? Well, clearly, he hasn't been obeying the law at all. And he's even violated some of the regulations of the Nazirite vow explicitly. By the way, all that feasting that happened at the party, or at the wedding rather, probably some alcohol involved there. There's no indication that he abstained from that. So this probably, from everything we can piece together in the story, is the last thing he hasn't broken. The last rule he hasn't just, I'm not going to worry about that. Shaving his head. So he doesn't give it up at first. First he says something, oh, if you tie me up with this specific kind of rope, well, Delilah tries it, and then the Philistines show up, and it doesn't work. He breaks out and fights off the Philistines. Delilah says, all right, that's not it. Tell me what it really is. Then he says, if you weave my hair into a loom, then I'll become weak. Tries that, and again, it doesn't work. But this time it's about his hair. Finally, he tells her, now just think about for a moment. 2 times he's told her what he said was the secret, and 2 times it's happened and people have shown up. How does he not know it's her? He probably does. Does he just enjoy living dangerously? Is he tempting fate? What's going on here? But he finally tells her, if you shave my head, I'll become weak. So she shaves his head. Actually, she lures him to sleep on her lap, and then someone else comes in and shaves his head. And then the Philistines show up. And this time, he still thinks. And by the way, when he wakes up, he probably realizes his head is shaved. I just think that's interesting. He probably realizes, now maybe in the haze of, maybe as he's first waking up, I don't realize what's happened. But nonetheless, I'm going to defeat him like I did before. But this time, God's strength has left him. It's almost like he assumed that God's strength would just stick around no matter what he did. That's been the case so far. But this was the final straw. Strength leaves him. They not only capture him, they not only imprison him, they gouge out his eyes. He is blinded violently by the Philistines and imprisoned. He is left for a while in this imprisonment, but eventually the Philistines are going to gather together and they're going to have a celebration. They're going to gather in a specific one of their temples to one of their idols. They're going to have this celebration, and as part of their celebration, in, I guess you could say, in triumph over their enemies, they're going to bring out Samson and make a show of it. Look at what we did. Even this champion of our subjects couldn't defeat us, no matter how hard he tried. They bring out Samson, and because he's now blind, they set him up between 2 poles. And of course, we're pretty familiar with what happened. These 2, I said poles, pillars really. These 2 pillars, in ancient architecture, these pillars would not be decorative. They were load-bearing. This is helping to hold up the temple. They set him between these 2 pillars. We're told his hair has started growing back at this point. Now, that detail is not given to us because the author is trying to make us think that the only thing that gave him his strength was literally his hair. But as a symbol, in a sense, of the deeper meaning of what's going on. Because ultimately, again, the power obviously is coming from God. But Samson is there, blinded, humiliated, between those 2 pillars. And what he does next is very interesting. He doesn't ask for his life. He doesn't ask to be delivered in any way. He just asks that God will one more time give him his strength. The strength that he used to have. There's so much I would love to know more than what is recorded about what actually is going on in Samson's mind. So much more I'd like to know about what's going on in God's mind, if we want to use that terminology. But nonetheless, it seems like, at the very least, there is a sense in which Samson certainly recognizes once again this power is coming from God. And certainly is saying, I want to do something that is going to help with God's plan here, even though, again, there's still a tint of revenge here as well. But nonetheless, it is a recognition of, God, you're the one who can do this or not. I'm asking you to give me my strength one more time. And he begins to push against the pillars. And God grants his wish. These are not pillars that an ordinary human being could push over. Most likely, these are pillars that would take many, many slaves a great deal of time and effort to be able to put in the exact position that they were in. But he begins to push, And as he begins to push, we're not exactly sure if these are stones stacked on top of each other or if one full piece of stone he's able to break apart. But he takes the pillars down, which disrupts the entire structure of the temple. And because this is a temple built for a whole lot of people to gather in and be together, kind of think of maybe like a community center type thing for an ancient city, the temple collapses and kills thousands of Philistines. And we're not just talking about run-of-the-mill Philistines. This would be the leaders of the Philistines here, which is going to allow Israel ultimately to escape from their captivity, their subjugation, maybe we should say, to the Philistines. And of course, Samson dies as well. As we think about this story for just a couple of more minutes this evening, I want us to consider a couple of ideas, really a couple of questions. And this is where I'm asking the questions for answers as well, of course. What kind of legacy did Samson leave behind? I just want us to ask that question as we really begin thinking about this story that's recorded. It's always a true story, but the story that's recorded for us. What kind of legacy did Samson leave behind? If you had to think of words to describe Samson's life, Samson's legacy, his story, what comes to mind?
He's pretty selfish.
Okay, I think that's very accurate. We see ultimately over and over again his decisions focused more on self than on anything else. Certainly not focused on what does God want me to do in this situation. That seems to be the furthest thing of his mind in most of his decisions. What else? How else might we describe Samson's legacy? Oh, very good. That's a good word. Very disappointing. So much wasted potential in Samson and how he chose to live his life. What else?
He was a hero to the Jews.
Okay, good. Certainly there were many things he did that were very heroic. But of course, how do we define hero? Heroic on the battlefield, certainly not heroic in his personal life. How else might we describe Samson and his legacy? If we were writing this, was that the truck or did somebody say something? If we were writing this as let's say a play, if this were made into, let's say, one of Shakespeare's plays, I think we could very quickly arrive at the categorization that this is a tragedy. This is certainly not a humorous story or a story that is really meant to be inspiring per se. Ultimately, this story is a tragedy. Not only because the hero dies at the end, because the hero dies at the end when a whole lot of things could have been a whole lot different. I mean, think about just in the history of the judges. While not all of the judges lived good lives, at least the whole time, they made some poor decisions. We think about Gideon, for example, at the end of his life, made some poor decisions. But are there any other judges that die like this? Most of them actually judge for the rest of their lives, are leaders for the rest of their lives. There's one or two others that there's a little bit of a different situation, but we'll leave that aside for a second because they're outliers. But typically speaking, Samson is not nearly the same as these other characters. It's very much a tragedy. So then we have to ask the question. Certainly, Samson was a deeply flawed character. He is not meant, and I hope we all already realize this, he is not meant to be an example of morality. That is not why Samson is recorded for us. And yet Samson is in the Hall of Fame of Faith in Hebrews chapter 11. So how could we say that Samson showed faith despite his many flaws?
Redemption at the end.
Okay, I do think that is a big part of this. We have to look at the end of his life. But why did that show faith? Where do we see his faith playing out? What does it look like?
It was submission.
Okay. Okay. Okay, good, good. Certainly there is the idea of, not interested in his own life, going back to what Liz said about selfishness. He doesn't seem to be selfish at so much in this particular decision. How else? How else did Samson show his faith?
He seemed to maybe be doing the right things until he got to a certain point where he was making his own choices.
Okay, good. There did seem to be a glimmer of, okay, maybe he's going the right track before he just went way off the rails. We talked a little bit with a couple of the other ones so far that we've looked at in Hebrews 11. We've talked a little bit about having faith in spite of things. Remember Gideon? His probably primary character trait that we're given is fear. He's a fearful person. At the beginning of the story, you might even call him a coward. And yet he chooses to show faith in spite of his fear. His fear never goes away. And yet he chooses to show faith in spite of it. Well, with Samson, we don't really have any fear shown by Samson throughout the story. That's not his flaw. His flaw, we could describe it as selfishness. We could describe it as worldliness. Describe it as a whole lot of other things. Immorality. The faith was not in how he lived his life. But we still see the faith in that he still believed that God could give him the power to accomplish the things that he did, especially, back to Andrew's point, at the very end. That was the moment where he knew what it felt like not to have his strength. And so he went to the right source and said, I know you can give me my strength back because I know it came from you all along. Could you give it to me one more time? I'll be honest, and this is why the Holy Spirit is the author of the Bible and not me. I don't think I would have put Samson in a list of, hey, here's some examples of faith. But as we alluded to last week as well, I hope we're beginning to see a pattern here. A lot of these characters that are listed in Hebrews 11, toward the end especially, are deeply flawed characters. And yet, we still see a degree of faith shown, and God saying, I can do something with that. That's the power that is demonstrated, that is shining the spotlight back to God in spite of the flaws of human beings. So as we wrap up, we already mentioned, Samson's story is a tragedy. Spin it however you might want to, and I imagine, both in Christianity and probably in Judaism as well, people have tried to kind of play down the bad side of Samson's story. That's not meant to be played down. That's the whole point. Samson's story is written as a tragedy. We're supposed to see what God can do even with flawed people, if they still choose, at least on some level. There are a whole lot of ways in which Samson did not demonstrate faith. But the ways that he did, God was still able to use. And that, once again, is a reflection on the power of God. Even a little sliver of faith, we might describe it, God can do something with that. And going back to the ideas of providence and things, he can accomplish his will through that. I hope that's helpful for us. We're going to look at another one next week. We've got a couple more for sure that we want to look at. Or actually, not next week. Sorry, is that singing? No, next week. It is next week. Okay. We're going to look at that next week. I've got all my dates mixed up. But I hope that this is helping us to see why these characters are here. If there is anyone who has a need, we always like to extend the Lord's invitation. We are here for one another to pray, to assist one another in whatever is going on. So if there is something we can help you with, please let us know as we sing together.
Yield not to temptation,
For yielding is sin.